Welcome, everybody, to Recovery Machine. My name's Nathan, joined as always by my co-host Corey. Today we have a guest, Dr. Sarah Michaud. Is that how it's
Michaud.
said? Michaud?
Yeah.
Oh, I butchered it.
That's all right. Everybody does.
So sorry, but so happy that you're here to join us today. You are residing down in a new place in Boston. That is correct. Somewhere in the Boston area.
Yep. In the central Mass outside of Boston. Yep.
Yeah. And you just downsized your house. You got yourself a nice, cool setup with more space outside, less space inside. Is that correct?
Very much so. Yes. I always say to people, I just live in the woods. More space the older I get. Less people, more space.
It makes sense to me. So one of the reasons that we sought you out was because you have just published a book. This is the book here. There we go. It's called Co-Crazy.
Crazy.
One Psychologist Recovery from Codependency and Addiction. You were kind enough to send us an actual copy, which is great. Lots of people want to do a e-text. And I like having a real book I can read. So. And it was a good read. The message is great. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And maybe we can learn some interesting things that aren't in the book as well and discuss some of the stuff that's in there. So,
it's funny. Nathan and I have been doing this for over a year, and we continue to find new topics to discuss and new avenues in the discussions about addiction and about mental health. We have not had an episode about codependency.
Right.
So far. So your timing was really great, and we're anxious to sort of hear more about what you can teach us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, it so goes hand in hand because my belief is really that underneath a lot of the addictions are people's untreated codependency. And the word codependency drives me nuts because I feel like it's so overused now. People throw it around. And I don't know if you know any of the history. I'm a lot older than you guys, but like back in kind of the 70s, the ACOA movement started, the Adult Children of Alcoholics. And there was, and then Melody Beattie came out with Codependent No More, and Janet Voigts and all the adult children, John Bradshaw, all those people back in kind of the 80s that coined the word. Really, I think it was coined in like 68, but now it's just tossed around. Everybody kind of uses it. And I think the definition has also changed over the years, as far as I'm concerned anyways, because I really want to bring it more into the mainstream. You could say the whole country's codependent. Do you know what I mean? When you look at what's going on now, what other people are doing are greatly affecting how I'm feeling or someone is feeling. So there's much broader definitions, and because the first definition, of course, really was the classic stereotypical male alcoholic with the housewife female codependent. And she enabled her husband by not being able to deal with his drinking and getting really upset. And, he would just drink more. And, then, the Bill W. started AA, his wife started Al-Anon, and, they realized, she's got to focus on herself and let him get himself sober and all of that. So it was very kind of that stereotypical, enabling the alcoholic and male, female and all that. And I really see it as a way of relating that starts way early on. I call it your earliest object relations in psychological terms, the parent-child dynamic. However that started, that's really going to be how we relate to all people eventually. That's why it's so powerful to me. But yeah, so it's a broad term to me now. And I would really define it more as a lack of a sense of self, and that I'm getting the way I feel about myself is basically on how the world responds to me. So I can only feel okay if other people around me are okay. And that's the dependency piece.
Right.
And, if you grow up with parents that are not the healthiest, you're going to learn from 3 or 4 or 5, geez, I need to make them okay, so I'm okay. And that, and then that plays out in our romantic relationships and all kinds of relationships, frankly. Yeah.
This is a people-pleasing type behavior. And it's one that we've discussed before as something that is not always, but often, especially with healthcare professionals, part of addictive behavior eventually. And the reason is often a lack of an ability to say no, a lack of an ability to draw boundaries that are healthy. And most importantly, which is, I believe, the underlying kind of message in your book, is an ability to understand that just like when you're on an airplane and there's a crisis and the mask comes down, the reason they tell you to put your mask on first before you start helping everyone else, there's a reason for that. And it's because if you're not well yourself, you're not equipped to help anyone anyway, whether you're, you might have the best intentions in the world, but so, I agree. The codependency, the word, I think it exploded out of the Minnesota model. And I think you're right there. Around the 70s was when that really started to take off, and then it became humongous in the 90s. And now I think it is definitely seen in a different light, and there's perhaps more kind of back and forth with the word codependency and how it relates to enabling and how that relates to different ways that people look at addictive behavior. But the other term is the title of your book, which is co-crazy. So what is there a difference between co-crazy and codependency?
They're really the same thing. But the reason I didn't want to say codependency in the title, but really my experiences with clients and patients over the years, and myself, my own experience, and friends and sponsees and programs and stuff, is people often come to therapy for a relationship issue, right? And what they've described to me over the years is they would say, I feel crazy. And so that's where it kind of came to be that co-crazy term, is even though they were spending, say a parent would come in and their 25-year-old son moved home, and they're doing everything they can to help them and to fix them and to get them, off of opiates, say, what's happening in reality is their life is getting worse and the kid's life is getting worse. So nobody is getting better. And they start to feel like they're going crazy because they say to themselves, why is it, Sarah? Why is it that I'm spending all this time calling professionals, making appointments, sending them to treatment? They're doing all these things and telling their kid how to get well, but they seem to be getting worse. And meanwhile, their life is imploding and they're like spending all this money. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I call in the book the big lie. It's like the belief for so many people, and I think it's highlighted in addictive relationships, is if I focus on this other person, and you can, it's on a spectrum, it could be in a marriage. If I focus on this other person and I try to help them and get them well, why then aren't they getting better? And why am I getting worse? And so it's this real tricky, delusional thinking that, oh, really the solution is, like you just said, Nathan, I have to focus on myself. I have to put the mask on myself. And if I can get better, then ultimately, perhaps they can get better. Not always. I mean, the classic is I'll have a couple come in and they've been married for 25 years and the guy's drinking, and the wife finally says, gets up the courage, to say, I need you to move out for 3 months. And then the guy gets sober. And the woman's like, well, why didn't you get sober for the last 20? Well, you never asked me to. I mean, again, it's not like his recovery is in her hands. That's not it. But if you're not going to speak up about what you need, another person is just going to keep doing what they've always done. I mean, and that's where the whole responsibility piece comes in.
Yes, there is there's an onus on both people for sure, regardless of whether it's somebody who's having trouble with drugs or alcohol and a spouse. If the communication isn't there, and this is a big problem for many different reasons, it can be actually deadly when somebody's hiding some kind of addictive behavior that ends up in an overdose or something that could have easily been prevented if the if doors of communication were open.
Right.
But
right.
why do you think? Go ahead, Corey.
I was just going to say, to me, the term kind of makes sense when I think back to myself, and we've talked a lot about perfectionism on this podcast, about like when you know, if I do more, then I will be enough, and if I do more, particularly for other people, then I will be enough. And, and I can't, you know, how many times I, either in my interpersonal relationships or at work, particularly at work, where I would go to work and shift after shift, push myself to the brink of collapse, and then started to require, or think I required, narcotics to keep myself up to that. And then I was always saying to myself, you know, damn it, I just did it again. I just pushed myself to the brink again. I just did it again, did this again. And it was like, why can't I break this cycle? So the co-crazy thing to me means like asking ourselves, like, why did I just do that again? When I did it,
and it's that whole thing about, why don't I put myself first? Do you know what I mean? Why is it more important that the patients at your job are happy, but I'm not? And I think it's okay to work 3 shifts in a row or whatever. You know what I mean? Absolutely. And nurses, half my clients were nurses. You know what I mean?
I believe you.
Mental health field, doctors. There's so much addiction in the helping fields. Teachers, social workers. So you guys, that's probably what your show is, right? I think you help a lot of people in that. Yeah. Because again, if we looked at the codependency piece, if the underlying piece is the codependency and I can't stop saying no, then the addiction is how I'm coping with that. You know what I mean? I can't say no, and I can't tolerate whatever happens. You know, what's happening.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it becomes a situation where the drug or the alcohol is just an easier way to deal with that uncomfortable feeling, where you know, it's going to take courage. Somebody's going to probably be, you know, it's going to be somebody, maybe whether it's a customer, a client, a patient, or a spouse. They're going to be uncomfortable, and you don't want to have that conversation, so you just numb out, right?
Right.
Why do you think why do you think it is kind of a human condition for so many of us? As a psychologist, you probably see this just so much, where people are unable to put themselves first. What do you think it is about our culture?
I've read Buddhism for years and stuff, and I don't think people like being uncomfortable. I think the human condition is, and this is
what a great answer.
We don't like being uncomfortable, and we don't like to be in pain. Right. Think about it. How many people change behaviors unless they have to? That's what addiction is all about, right? And the thing with co-crazy is, or codependency is, and that's what I really wanted to get to in the book, was for so long, it's like the codependent person was kind of the victim, you know, like, oh, my husband's drinking or depressed, and I'm the one that has to take care of him. And where I wanted to take it was, oh no, you're getting something out of it. You know, that's why I really wanted to take it to this other level, which is, it's really about me. I can't tolerate, and you both have touched on this, I can't tolerate what's happening inside me if I say, I need to ask you to leave. It's not about what they're going to feel. It's about what I'm going to feel, you know? So, I think human beings, it's just, and think about the culture now. There's so much stimulus, and you're constantly, think of the busyness addiction. People, to me, are getting further and further away from themselves, which means I'm going to have to do more. You know what I mean? Rather than really the solution is, you know, being more with yourself, tolerating what's happening, you know, noticing just identifying what's happening. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's got to be some loss of awareness with the way that our culture is super distracted. Our attention spans are super fragmented. Maybe now it's harder for people than ever to to do that check-in that, was maybe a little bit easier 10, 20 years ago, where you could, calm down after work and think about what's going on in your life and be aware of, that feeling inside, like you describe it as I like the way you put it, as a relentless, low grade, chronic hum of anxiety. And, if you're not, I think people are capable of continuing on and on and on and on and on, especially if they're very busy and distracted. And there can be all sorts of sirens and bells going on psychologically. And they've just basically chosen not to pay attention. It's like you're going to put your earmuffs on and just keep trucking.
Right. And that's why I do think it usually takes something like a relationship crisis, I don't know, a mental crisis, or a physical crisis. Something happens medically, they go to their physical and their liver enzymes are up or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it takes something to push someone over. I mean, you guys have had relationships, right? When do you really address it? When someone says to you, hey, this isn't working, mm-hmm. Now I have to look at myself and do something about it. Or if I'm in enough pain or discomfort about something my partner is doing, then I'll do something about it. But people, with work addiction, I mean, there's so many ways people cope with their issues today. I mean, addictions, yes, distraction, anything. Right. So it's hard for someone really to get in touch with that or want to get in touch with that, even though to me, that's where peace resides. If I can get rid of all that stuff and I'm able to be with myself, I'm going to be peaceful and okay, no matter what happens.
And if you're addressing those concerns that you should be addressing. Yeah. Yes. So your career must have been just full of trying to motivate people to be aware of these types of things that they're not addressing. And then, trying to constructively work them towards getting up the courage to fix those problems, or at least start to fix them.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky that, I started at McLean Hospital, which is like a big psych hospital around here. And that's where I got trained and was in the detox. And then they opened a residential. I don't know what you guys label it up in Canada, like residential treatment centers and detoxes. So then I went to a residential and started their program. And then I had a practice for 25 years. But most of the people that came to me, a good percentage of people wanted to stop using. I mean, I was the addiction person with this group of therapists.
Oh, okay.
But, so it's tricky though, because everybody's different. Like, because I'm sober, like I wouldn't spend a year seeing someone if they were using. That's just not what I would do, because I don't think that's helpful. Other therapists would. I say to someone, if someone comes to me for a substance abuse problem, I say, look, why don't we spend 3 months together, especially if they're ambivalent about quitting. I'll say, let's spend 3 months together. You tell me what you want to do. Do you want to cut down? Do you want to quit? And we'll have a plan of action. And then let's see after 3 months if it's working. Mm-hmm. The thing is that say somebody, and I don't know what your guys' belief system is around this, but say someone would come in and say, okay, I want to control my drinking. And I'd say to them, well, what does that look like? Well, I'm going to have 2 drinks on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and 3 drinks on Saturday. And I'd say, okay, that's what you're going to do. And the thing with that is ultimately it never works out. Ultimately, someone may be able to do that for a couple of months, maybe till there's a wedding, maybe whatever. They may be able to do it for a little while, but ultimately, if they have an addiction problem, they can't keep it to that level. And so then we have to make some kind of decision. Do you want to, because the thing with controlled drinking is, even if someone is maybe drinking 2 drinks on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the rest of the time they're obsessing about it. So the addictive compulsive behavior, like the obsessive compulsive behavior, the compulsive behavior may have slowed down, but the obsessive behavior will increase. So, again, everybody's different. I mean, what's really funny about this is I'm going to give you a great example. So I just moved into this little house and I have a landlord and he lives in the big house next door. And when I moved in and he heard I worked with addiction, he gave me this like, oh no. So I guess he was married to a woman who was an alcoholic for 25 years and he just divorced her. So he is fixing something in my house in the middle of January. And it's like January 15th. And I said, how are you doing? And he said, well, I just quit drinking, sugar, and caffeine. And it's like January 15th. And I said, oh, and I said, that's great. And he said, it's dry January. And I'm thinking to myself, it's January 15th. And he had only done it for 3 days. So first of all, he didn't start January 1st for dry January. He didn't get to it till the 15th. So he comes over the other day and I said, how's it going? And he says, I haven't drank in 7 weeks. As he was leaving, he said, oh, but I've, about 5 times I have gone out with some friends. So in his mind, he hasn't drank for 7 weeks, except for the 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, addiction to me is so insidious and such a mental, it's called the mental illness, but it has so many mental components that he can believe he's sober, but he's drank 5 times. And again, there's nothing wrong with that if he's not an addict, but he's saying, I haven't drank for 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I hear what you're saying, and I think this is a real problem with insidious is a good word that I like to use with alcohol, because alcohol is a different animal. And the way I look at it is, if you're going to say your client there who did want to manage the alcohol use, or I mean, there is ways you can do that with the Sinclair method is a good way to do it. But what I would suggest for people who are trying to do that is that they get 90 days of abstinence in before they make that decision.
Right.
And the reason for that is because it allows for 90 days. There's pretty good evidence behind that as being a length of time that's sufficient for some clarity to return, so that you can start to get that insight that alcohol itself in its insidious nature is preventing you from seeing, as you're talking about this gentleman who thinks he isn't drinking, but he's still drinking. When you're in that pattern, especially with alcohol, it's very difficult to get to slow down. With most addictive, I mean, it's possible to do it with other drugs, but I believe it's most productive to have at least 90 days of abstinence. And then after that point, you've got some clarity, and you can see the difference in your life, and you say, well, which substance was it a polysubstance issue? And if so, which substance worked, which didn't? You can make decisions based on that at that time. I'm not, for some people, abstinence is going to probably be the best way to live their life. For other people,
whatever works for every individual.
It's going to be, but alcohol is just such a tough one. And then, and I tip my hat to anybody who is able to manage that long term, such as yourself. I mean, it's got to be up there with one of the. You can't think your way out of it, because it affects your ability to make a decision right off the bat. So you really have to make a leap of faith to get out of there.
Well, that's the thing with addiction too. And I mean, we may have different beliefs around this, but the mental component, and it's not just with addiction. I mean, I think like you guys are talking about, a lot of this is the human condition. I mean, we can rationalize or minimize or deny anything. I mean, denial was one of Freud's defenses, right? So it's not like these are just concepts to addiction. But the problem with addiction is I think they just become so extreme. I mean, I've heard people minimize and rationalize everything. And even when people get sober, they can still, I've rationalized behaviors. We can still rationalize things.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because we want to feel okay about our behaviors.
Mm.
But we somehow can make it okay. You know, oh, I had an affair, but you know what? My wife wasn't having sex with me, or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? We can rationalize anything. So it is tricky because, I mean, the thing with alcoholism or a lot of addictions is it tells you you're okay when you're not. So your mind will say, oh, I could drink tonight. I haven't drank for 3 weeks. I'll go out with John tonight. We'll have a couple of drinks. You know, that's what it says to you. So it is, unless you have some spaciousness and knowledge that it does get you mentally, you know, I mean,
that's why it takes a few kicks at the can, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And you ask, or I guess you implore the reader or the client to ask some really tough questions of themselves. And so is it all about, like, the word that keeps coming up in my mind right now is avoidance.
Yeah.
You know, like I really liked your chapter on fear.
Yeah.
And some of the really tough questions that you're requesting us to ask ourselves.
Right.
Like, what are we actually afraid of? When was the first time we recall that fear?
I know.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah.
And you know, for me, I sort of went through those questions, and
Did you have an insight?
Well, I've done ample therapy.
Right.
I've answered some of those questions before, but
yes, of course.
It's really true that I was able to identify the fear I felt as an adult, both with addictive behavior and relationships, and draw a line right back to childhood with that.
Yes.
And the fear, I think, was part of the word that comes with the fear was avoidance.
Yes.
Avoidance avoidance of a reaction, avoidance of discomfort.
Yes.
And I guess I wanted to ask you too, what do you then do with the resistance that comes up from people? Because you're asking people, that's a pretty tough, you're asking them to sort of look inward and say, hey, go there. What do you do when there's resistance there?
Well, I think it depends how much someone is suffering. I mean, to me, a lot of people have anxiety, right? And so if someone's anxious or depressed, you know, my feeling is anxiety and depression are kind of like these umbrella diagnoses. And really, there's a lot of things underneath them, right? I mean, you guys know this, you know, sadness and anger and, you know, fear and powerlessness and helplessness and trauma, all these things underneath it. And so if someone is, and for me, the anger piece, the reason I wrote the chapters on fear and anger is, to me, and I'm kind of a simple person in the sense of, you know, the way I work, you know, I'm very kind of like fact-based, and I really believe that the anger and fear, and I think for a lot of human beings, not just addicts, is really at the bottom of so much of our symptomology and our agitation and our anxiety. So I really believe, and you guys know Gabor Mate probably, and all the stuff on the nervous system and our systems being amped up. I really believe that if you can get in touch with whatever your beliefs are, your past wounds, or do some of these processes that I do with people around their resentments and their fears, you can really identify, gee, when did this start? You know, something happens where, you know, and it's not necessarily even a trauma for a lot of these fears. And a lot of the fears are interpersonal, you know, rejection, someone getting mad, abandonment, someone being hurt, you know, me hurting someone's feelings, someone else's opinion, rejection. I mean, and so many of them get played out in our relationships. And to me, if you can go back and identify when it started, and then like what you just said, Corey, which is, oh, my coping skill was to avoid. Like someone else may deny or act out or do addictions or become provocative or whatever it is, rationalize. we all have these ways we survived because of that incident.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, once we get out of our home and we, leave at 18 or whatever, we're still using all of those coping skills, right? So what I do a lot of is I work with someone on what are some new behaviors. Once you've identified what the old behaviors are, one being addiction and another being co-crazy, right? What are these things that aren't working anymore? And what are, say, 3 behaviors you can do now instead of avoidance that are really going to help you work with this fear,
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's really thinking of tangible solutions and identifying behaviors and new skills, so you don't have to walk around, not that you wouldn't maybe have a fear of rejection if you went on a date, it might pop up, but you'd be able to identify it and say, oh, that's from the past. I mean, I think that's so much of the freedom is just identifying that a lot of these things are not happening now. So much that happens in our systems is from, 40 years ago. I've had clients that are in their 70s talking about the gal at the high school dance that didn't speak to them. I mean, it's like, and because of that, I'm not going to speak to women for 40 years. I mean, it's like, this stuff is so significant.
For sure.
But if we don't know it, it's really hard to shift it. I don't know if that answered your question, but
totally.
Yeah.
And I guess like paying attention to that resistance within ourselves, paying attention to what those rubs are, what those spikes and thorns in our reactions are. Hey.
Yes, and to me, I swear every spiritual book or book I read on recovery and stuff, it always talks about, and I do believe this, and the Buddhism stuff, it's what we resist persists. I mean, I just believe that now in my heart of hearts.
Yeah.
If I resist an insight or I resist something I need to do, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
And it's going to come out in some other way. I may not feel like, buying a bag of Coke tonight, but I might go, get ice cream or what, I mean, it's still, how am I going to deal with it where I can get to the other side?
Yeah, that goes well with something you wrote there in your book. You wrote, as a child, I felt responsible for my father's happiness and felt controlled by him, which led to a crippling fear of upsetting people. And then I really like the terms you used here, manifesting as the relentless, low-grade, chronic hum of anxiety.
Anxiety, yeah.
And that's something that me and Corey talk about. We call it the beehive.
Absolutely.
And
I can totally relate to that.
So you're talking about being aware of the origin of, I've done some work towards that end. And so where does the beehive start? And then identifying, I guess that, I mean, for me, I still struggle with that anxiety, and I know where it comes from, but I can't seem to find a way to kind of uproot it.
To quell it. Right.
Fix me, doctor.
No. I'm just thinking about it. I just think it's so interesting because anxiety is like really such a common way we all kind of can, relate to one another. I feel anxious. And I guess if I look at, and this is another reason I talk about anger a lot, because the thing about being codependent is codependents, have this way of, I'm the nice guy. But I really believe, and I believe this with addiction too, that there is so much repressed anger. And I really think the resentment piece, and I'm just talking about what's underneath anxiety. I think there's fears. I think there's grief. I think there's unresolved wounds. But I also think there's years of resentment. There's years of pushing feelings down that weren't processed. And anger to me is, this is why I think of the culture today too, because everybody's pissed off. It's just really important to give kind of space to, I'm really upset about this thing. And if I don't deal with it, I believe the result is anxiety. If I have a fight with my partner, but I think it's, but I deny it and say, oh, she didn't really upset me or he didn't really upset me. The next day, I believe someone's going to have some anxiety because they're not processing what happened the previous day or the previous week. And that's what codependents do. Oh, it's okay. They didn't mean it, blah, blah, blah. And that's why I talk a lot about the both and, because it's so easy to minimize, oh, my feelings aren't really hurt or whatever. And yet it's going to come out somewhere. So the anxiety, like you're saying, it's like really looking at, and again, it goes back to being in touch with what's happening inside. Did something happen that I'm resentful about? Have I worked through all that, anger towards people or resentments I'm holding? And the other piece is, what are the meanings I'm making up? We talk a lot about the meanings, because two people can grow up in the same household with the same parents and have completely different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, I just think the anxiety is like, what am I not allowing myself really to experience underneath the anxiety? That's how I've worked with it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely 100% correct there. It's I know, like I'm a very angry individual and have been for a long time. Like you get good at pushing things down, and I've gotten better. As an adult, I've gotten better at kind of stopping the anger train or the flow of anger from coming in. But I believe that started very early.
Absolutely.
So there's probably a ton of stuff there. And because it happened so long ago, I don't know how to parse that anger out.
Yes.
Because
I will do with you guys? I don't know if you'd want me to do this, but I have this great way of helping people work through some of the anger and the wounds. Like, I have this sheet I use. Mm-hmm. And, it's from being in AA and other programs and stuff, but it really helps you because my old sponsor used to say, behind every resentment is a wound, right? Mm-hmm. And so, the anger is a way to protect yourself, but I think there's so many different pieces of it, because an event can happen. Say you were abused and you're 5 and something happens. There's not just what happened, but there's what I decided about myself. There's what I decided about people in general. There's what I'm making up in my head now about, is the world safe? Is it not safe? There's all these ways I figured out how to cope. There's what I call the lies I tell myself because of this event. Mm-hmm. And then to me at the bottom is always the fear. So the fear is, if I'm abused, fear of what people are going to think of me, fear of upsetting someone, fear of my own feelings, fear of getting angry. And so there's this sheet I have, and I'll email it to you or whatever. And
yeah, please do.
Just try to practice one resentment. Think of an event and try to work through it and see if you can get in touch with more pieces of it. Because you're absolutely right. Tons of stuff happens to us. And the anger, to me, is a tough one, because I think, and for a lot of men, it's like, it's hard you might be able to get it out through athletics or but resolving the underlying hurt and wound is harder. And moving on and getting to forgiving, it's not even forgiving them. To me, a lot of it is forgiving myself.
It has to be. Yeah, I think that's the only solution.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
The only realistic one, anyways.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to take a look at that.
A biggie. It's a biggie. And the thing is, I think most people, either people say, oh, I'm not the type that gets angry, or there are people like you say that I know I'm angry. I think anger is so easy to deny and repress, especially if you're a good person and you're in the helping fields.
That's right.
Sarah, I've talked about this on the show before, but there were two traumas that I can think of. The literal trauma of other people's pain, suffering, death, injury that I experienced as an ER nurse.
Yes.
Then all the while I'm, developing this building resentment for the fact that I was sort of felt like I was betraying myself in this job. I was constantly running on empty, constantly denying my own needs. And then because I was sort of, for various reasons, wired to be this people pleaser, people would say to me, "Oh, Corey, you're so good at your job. Do you like what you do?" And I would say, I'd be having the worst day, and I'd say, "Oh, I love it. I love it." And then in my head, I would think like, "Oh, why did I just say I love it? I don't love it. I fucking hate it. I hate it." And looking, I've had to kind of
I get it.
That, and so I've had to heal from the actual trauma that I experienced literally at the job, but like that betrayal of self.
Yes.
There were wounds that caused me to betray myself there, that caused me to say I love it because I thought it was making people happy, and I thought it would then give, other people would then validate me more.
Yes.
That me perpetuating that because I was afraid of facing it, it made those wounds feel sort of larger, I think, in a sense.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's cognitive dissonance, just going around and around in a circle.
That's exactly what I was just saying. I really believe when I'm working with someone too, the resentments towards self are the hardest ones to get rid of.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean? Like, it's one thing when you feel like you have justified resentments, but the problem with resentment is who's being hurt. That's the thing, right? When we're angry and resentful, people are not walking around. They don't even know resentful at them. Who's being hurt? I'm the one. I'm the one that's hurting myself because I'm pissed off all the time. So that's the other thing with anger is it doesn't help anybody, especially me.
No.
That's the thing.
If there was an angle that you could take on anger as being a useful thing, it would be that it is an energy source that you can be aware of, that is pointing you in the direction of something that needs to be corrected.
Absolutely.
But the amount of energy that I feel it drains out of me, maintaining my, day-to-day whatever, while dragging this beehive around with me is debilitating sometimes.
Yes.
Perhaps I exaggerate, but it sometimes it feels heavy.
It is heavy. And it does weigh us down, and it's cumulative. I mean, think about it. I mean, I'm working with a guy right now who's 82 and, he's been clean and sober for like 40 years, but he's never really dealt with his underlying kind of anger and codependency and father trauma and all this stuff. And so I give the assignment, make a list of names of people that you feel like you're still angry with. And then we do this process. And it was so overwhelming to him because he said, "You know what? I can't believe how angry I still am. And I thought I had kind of resolved it, but how it's showing up for him is he's depressed. That's why he came to see me." And, that's the other symptom. Like it is the other symptom. Go out or in, right? Yeah.
And it's the smoldering anger that takes your energy, and when your energy goes, it turns to apathy, and when apathy shows up, depression sets in.
That's
what I've noticed in myself anyway.
Yes, absolutely. So it's really key to, that's what I've been doing with him, to try to externalize it and get it on paper and start getting some space from it. Because like you're saying, this stuff could have happened years ago. I mean, stuff can happen yesterday, but it's the stuff that we're still dragging around that's really the heaviest. I agree.
Good for that. The guy's 82 and he's doing that kind of work. Hat tip to that gentleman.
He's been kind of this, and he's in a very codependent relationship with his wife for 45 years. She's literally done everything for him. And I think, they're struggling a little bit. So he's really needing to look at himself. Yeah. So, I mean, what are the options? I mean, stay depressed or do some, that's the thing. There aren't many options. I mean, especially if you get into that depression and just stay there, there's, you can wait till it passes. I mean, some people do that, whatever, but trying to get some movement going.
Yeah, at 82, you're probably a little more anxious to get going, you know?
You would think.
So maybe this is a good segue to the next question.
Please.
Learning to set boundaries is a crucial skill. Voicing and being firm on what you're willing to tolerate from others helps prevent resentment, anger, confusion. On page 159, you talk about how setting boundaries takes courage, self-love, trust, and belief in your sanity and your serenity. So where should people start if they're having trouble drawing that line?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes it's like, because you're right, people are terrified. Again, that's why I talk so much about, I say just sit with yourself for 5 minutes a lot, because so much of setting boundaries is tolerating what's happening. And it's not, again, it goes back to that thing where it's not really tolerating what's happening for the other person as you setting the boundaries. It's what's happening inside of me when I say no to my kid having another cookie or whatever it is. I mean, parents are, oh God, we could get into, I just did a talk to a bunch of parents and I'm telling you, the parents of today, it's like, it makes me crazy. They have such low tolerance for feelings. It's like, and I mean, you with your child, it's so important to know how to set boundaries with kids. This is we've gone off on a tangent. I've gone off on a tangent.
That's okay.
It's an important tangent.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you don't do it when they're 2 and 3 and 4, literally, it ain't going to get easier at 16.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying what I see with my addict clients a lot is they never set boundaries when the kids were little and then they get sober and now they've got these wild kids running their home. And, so it's like they have to start with noticing, oh my God, I'm feeling really uncomfortable when I tell my kid he's got to come in by 11 or whatever. And it's really tricky when people get sober because they have so much guilt, right? Sober parents are a whole other ball game. And it's just saying to yourself, literally, this is the best thing for both of us. This is the best thing for both of us. But setting boundaries in general, I mean, we could do a whole episode on parenting. Setting boundaries in general, I say to people, do it with, the girl at Dunkin' Donuts. I don't know if you have Dunkin' Donuts here, but, start with, when they didn't put cream in your coffee or, some person at work that you don't really feel an energy with that you can say, oh, could you do this assignment that you didn't do this right or whatever. Start with relationships that are less threatening.
Yeah.
That's what I say to people. And the other thing to remember is when you start setting boundaries, you're going to feel guilty. I mean, you got to kind of know that you're not going to feel comfortable for a while.
That's a good point. It's a great point. Until you understand, I think once there's an understanding there that you're actually doing overall, the sum is more good than bad. And once that fact is set in, then maybe that guilt will relent a little bit.
Yes. And saying to yourself, it really is always the best thing for the relationship. Even if someone's upset about it, if you're speaking your truth about what you need, you're saying, oh, honey, I can't do that tonight, whatever the situation is. It's really honesty in a relationship. And if you can't set a boundary, you're not really being honest in your relationship.
It's true.
So anyways.
Yep. And it's a huge,
it's huge.
Demolished relationships by not being honest about that.
Which activates the anger and resentment.
Of course.
I mean, that's how that's connected as well. Like when you're talking about work and you're over functioning, Corey, and you're doing all this stuff that you don't want to be doing, what's happening? Fueling resentment.
Yeah.
Because like towards yourself and others.
Yeah, totally.
So it's tricky.
Sarah, can you give us an example of, because when I think about that discomfort and setting a boundary, there's like 2 to 4 minutes of like really intense discomfort. Like it's the hardest right when you do it. Yeah. How can someone get through that initial like super short term moment of discomfort?
So true. It's so funny because I worked with this. Have you ever heard of Peter Levine? He does this somatic experiencing work. He's Gabor Mate and the whole body stuff. He's a person that started this type of therapy called somatic experiencing. And the belief is basically that everything that's happened to us is in our bodies and is stuck somewhere energetically. And the only way we can really heal is to really get in touch with how it's manifesting. And he talks about, when you're having a feeling, all that's happening are intense bodily experiences. So, it's like really saying to yourself, all that's happening is my body is experiencing some physiological sensation. That's it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's so I think also that if you can practice with a few that aren't that challenging and you get to the other side, I think you can know that you can survive it, right? If you practice with the girl with the coffee, then when you set a limit with your kid, oh, we're going to get through this and I can tolerate this. But the thing is it's the fear question, right? I think for a lot of people, what I work with is what fear is getting activated when you set the boundary, and then you take it back to the early trauma. So, for example, if my son is here, God, he just was home with his girlfriend from New York, and they left literally 5 minutes before I got on with you guys. Speaking of boundaries, oh, we're leaving. We're leaving as I'm getting all amped up. Anyways, so say you're setting a boundary with a teenager and they're getting angry and you're noticing you're getting up, it's hard to tolerate, but you're going to say, you need to, what I used to tell my son, you need to get off your Xbox after 2 hours. What's happening for me is not necessarily fear of my son having feelings. What's happening to me is some old fear about speaking up, right? So then I take myself back. I'm like, why am I so afraid to speak up? Oh, because my dad was a really angry person. And when I used to speak up, he would lose it. So I'm putting that on my setting boundaries experience with my son. So it's always kind of looking at, and I say that about anger, it's never about the present moment. It's the same with setting boundaries. It's remembering the activation in your system is really not about the present situation. It's really about the past. Mm-hmm. So you're right. It's hard to tolerate the 30 seconds or whatever it is. But I think it's practice. It's just practice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true, Sarah. Like I was, the memory that came to mind for me was this past Christmas, going to pick out a Christmas tree, and got out into the way back of my town and got onto this Christmas tree farm, and the farmer walked us way back to look at the Christmas trees, and he said, by the way, they're $85 a piece for a 5-foot tree. And I thought, I had this like all in like 15 seconds thought, if I say no to this guy, I have to walk all the way back to the car and set that boundary. But then I thought, well, I'm not paying $85 for a Christmas tree, so I have to set the boundary. And I did it, and it felt great. It felt great to do. And then I thought, geez, a couple of years ago, I would have just like forked out the $85.
Oh, amen.
So I would have been so paralyzed by having to set the boundary. But it does feel good, right? It like there's something that happens to our confidence, our self-esteem.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a self-efficacy thing for sure. And I think it's also important to put in there that I believe that many times when I've set boundaries with people, I expect it to go a certain way that is usually much more catastrophic than it actually goes. So lots of times people are very accommodating. They're like, oh, you know what? I didn't even think about that.
Right.
And in my mind, it's bordering on malicious, right?
Right.
But it's just something they're not paying attention to or whatever, and everything's fine.
That's such a great point too. You're absolutely right. So many times when we feel afraid of speaking up, it always works. Most of the time it just works out. It's not like people are going to lose it on us. I mean, most of the time, you're absolutely right.
And if they do lose it on you, then you learn something too.
Oh, well, right. You can still survive that. That's absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, I'll never forget that the classic example I have in my head of like a child boundary thing is I was in this mall one time and I noticed there were like 10 family members all in this kind of half moon, again, like looking at something against the wall, but I didn't know what was happening. And they were all, and some of them were grandparents. It was like an extended family all together. And some of them were kind of kneeling down and I heard them talking. So I'm like, oh God, who's against the wall? Like, why? Literally there was 10 of them, grandparents, parents, uncles. And they were there for literally, I don't know, I watched them for 8 minutes or something. And I kept wondering what is happening. And I literally, suddenly one of the people left the semicircle and there was a 2-year-old that had 10 people captured that they were negotiating with a 2-year-old. I mean, negotiate with a 2-year-old that had them captured. It's like you pick them up and you leave them all. You know what I mean? But it was like such the quintessential example of being hostage to somebody, not being able to set a boundary, and it not being good for the 2-year-old. Because now think about that. The 2-year-old thinks they can control 11 people. Mm-hmm. Do you know that all that does is scare kids, frankly. That's a whole other conversation. But I mean, it's just wild. It's wild what our fears can, to the degrees to which they can take us.
Yeah.
Boundaries are huge, though.
For sure.
And really for your own happiness and peace of mind, too, because I think when we don't set boundaries, again, the anxiety, the anger, the preoccupation with the event, all of that stuff can take us out.
Yeah. So it requires awareness. It requires, I don't know what kind of, it's a skill like anything else, I guess, just checking in with yourself, seeing where the newest sources of anger, resentment, and anxiety are coming from, and then associating those with whatever the source is and trying to deal with it as it comes in. Because it's never, being a human being, I mean, part of the whole situation is dealing with those types of encounters and relationships. So, a great skill set to work on, and
one other tool that might be helpful for you or your audience is whenever I'm feeling kind of, I don't know, you know that feeling when you're kind of off and you don't know what it is. And you're like, did something happen? Am I upset? I write across exactly. I write across the top of a piece of paper, what am I angry about? What am I sad about? And what am I afraid of? And I just free write and and literally, if I just focus on those 3 words, anger, sadness, and fear, a lot of times I get to what's happening underneath the anxiety.
That's a great, it's a great exercise.
Writing helps. Yeah. Because sometimes in our unconscious, we know what's going on, but we can't articulate it. I mean, obviously sometimes when we just start talking it out with someone, we can get to it. Yeah.
It's like, it's the same mechanism as brainstorming kind of, right?
Yes. I mean, it's really free association, like Freud, free associating just kind of what's coming to your mind. I mean, who's that woman that does the morning pages? Oh, she wrote The Artist's Way. Do you know that book? I can't remember her name now, but she had this thing where every morning write 3 pages of just your thoughts, and they're called morning pages. And it's this way of just getting out whatever's kind of accumulated in the last 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good skill too. God, I know it's 2:00. I feel like I've talked forever. I'm so sorry. I can talk about this stuff forever.
No, you're a wonderful guest, Sarah. And You've taught us a whole bunch of stuff here. Is there anything you wanted to let people know about your book and where they could find it? And
oh, right. I mean, the only thing, you can get the book on Amazon. You can go to my website. I have a few other, talks on my website. The thing that we just launched that we're doing right now is called Leaving Crazy Town with Finn and Sarah. I think I sent you guys a video.
Yep.
So we started this YouTube channel. A friend of mine who's an attorney who's sober 6 years. And he and I have a similar sense of humor. So we wanted to talk about serious topics and yet have some lightness and joy because addiction can be so intense. Mm-hmm. And so Leaving Crazy Town with Finn and Sarah, you can subscribe and we put out a video each week. And that's really what we're focusing on right now. So or my website, drsarahmichaud.com.
Okay, perfect. I'll put links to all of those in the description for the YouTube video, and it'll be on our website as well.
Excellent. And, if anything, I can be of service to you guys in any ways, please let me know. And I'm going to email you the resentment sheet.
Please do.
Yes, I really will, because it's really helpful.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
It was so nice to meet you too. You're lovely. Thank you so much. Anytime.
Right back
Likewise.
at you. Yeah.
Likewise.
Yes.
Yeah, this has been
Any
lots of fun.
way I can be of help. I mean, definitely. And keep up the great work.
Will do.
Thank you.
Doing good stuff.
We'll say goodbye for now and enjoy your new place, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye. Thanks, you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarah.